What's up, everybody? My name is J Raj, and today I'm going to be going over my thoughts and my interpretations of the show Breaking Bad. As I just finished watching it for the first time, couldn't help but binge watch it. But yeah, I'm just going to go into my thoughts and things that I notice and my interpretations of it. So let's get this thing started. So, Breaking Bad follows a man by the name of Walter White, who is actually a chemistry teacher for a school in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He's a very hardworking man, and to help provide for his family, he also works at a car wash on the weekends. He's someone that I feel like everyone can relate to. It shows a hardworking man that no matter how hard he works, how hard he tries to provide for his family, he ends up feeling beat up, unappreciated, and just has a longing for more. The story ends up shifting though when Walter White figures out that he is diagnosed with lung cancer. And while this is terrible news for his family that he is very close to, it seems like it gives Walter a new confidence. He has a certain time period where he's not expected to live by, and it seems like he is more willing to do things and be more bold in his actions because he knows even if there is consequences, they're not going to affect him that much longer because he's supposed to die anyway. So we see him doing multiple things that typically Walter White will not do. But the cancer diagnosis seemingly gives him a new confidence. We see him standing up to his rude boss at the car wash. We see him handling some things different with his wife. And we also just see him seeming to get a new confidence about himself. And he's an interesting character as you watch him. He's a man that we can all relate to because in society it feels like sometimes no matter how much you work, how hard you try, it's always just so hard to get ahead. And this game of life, it's not a game, but sometimes it feels like it. It has a habit of just pushing you down. For every step forward, it feels like you got to take 2 or 3 steps back. So this is kind of what Walter White is going through. And I've noticed that it seems like he's a man that he wants to feel needed. And he also just, he's used to being the smartest guy in the room. But when it comes to his cancer, he realizes that what he's doing with his life is not working. If he were to die, he would have nothing to leave for his family when it comes to finances. So he gets the urge that he needs to do something to be able to leave a good bit of money for his family to fall onto whenever he passes away. So that kind of progresses the plot for this. After hearing many stories from his brother-in-law, Hank Strader, who was a DEA agent, where he would talk about drug busts and things like that, Walter gets wind of how much money that these meth dealers can make. And with Walter being a genius in chemistry and also being a chemistry teacher, he sees this as an opportunity and he decides to take a ride along with his brother-in-law, Hank, to see what busting the drug operations would look like. And this ends up leading him to a former student of his named Jesse Pinkman. During a drug bust, Jesse gets away, but Walter, without his brother-in-law Hank knowing, he talks to Jesse Pinkman, who's really thrown off that his former teacher is approaching him in this way. And he basically tells Jesse that with his knowledge in chemistry, if Jesse were to show him the ropes on how to make meth, that they could run a drug empire together, because Walter saw this as the way to get this stash of money to leave to his family. So Jesse Pinkman agrees. And, initially they kind of clash because Jesse is more of a carefree soul, but Walter White is very strict, to the point, and he's used to being right. He doesn't want anyone questioning him. So with this business, he strictly told Jesse that he is going to only produce the meth and that Jesse will be solely responsible for distributing it, because he did not want anyone to ever see his face, because he knew that not only would this ruin his reputation, but it would also potentially put him and his family in danger. So while doing some dealings, they end up meeting this man by the name of Tuco Salamanca, and he basically has ties to the cartel and ends up screwing over Jesse Pinkman as he's trying to get the money for some meth that they were dealing to Tuco and his gang. So Tuco Salamanca tried to screw him over. Walter, with this new confidence that he has, he gets the guts to show up to Tuco's base where his operations occur at, confronts him, and he tells Tuco that his name is Heisenberg, and he uses a chemical explosion. He had mixed some chemicals together, threw them down, blew up a bunch of that building to really weaken the operations of Tuco. And like we said, his name is now Heisenberg. That's the name that he had told Tuco. So rumblings in the streets start happening of a man named Heisenberg, a genius man who can make meth that is 99% pure. Not only does Heisenberg or Walter White make the purest meth, but now his name is getting spread in the streets, or his fake name at least. So with his name being spread through the streets, this only added to Walt's newfound confidence, because the cancer gave him the confidence. Now there's rumblings of a man named Heisenberg who is the best at his craft in making meth. So this fueled Walt to become more prideful. He started to feel untouchable, and he had an eagerness to be known even more in the drug world. And we end up fast forward to the future in the show. We figure out that his motive for wanting to be known ends up rooting back to him being part of a company that got started up with two other people called Gray Matter. And it ends up, some drama happens between Walt and a former significant other. Walt sells his share in the company for $5,000, but fast forward to the current day, that company is now worth $3 billion. So Walt, his motive for wanting to be known has to do with the fact that he would have been known if he hadn't sold his share in the company. So in the beginning, Walt had good boundaries for the business, never wanting to show his face, always keeping his personal life separate from his business life. But after showing his face and, revealing himself as Heisenberg, there have been people that see him. And it starts to become apparent that his personal life and his drug business are going to end up clashing. In the world that Walt was used to was the classroom. And he, like I said, was used to being the smartest one there. But that knowledge, although it does transfer into making the purest meth around, it did not translate to knowledge of him knowing how business is done when it comes to the streets. And as he gets more and more involved with this business, he slowly gets distant and even more distant from his family. And he ends up, they ask him what's going on. And every chance he gets, he lies to them. And he tries to convince them that everything is fine. And I will say, on a personal note, Walter White is too good at lying. It actually made me sort of uncomfortable to sit there and listen to him and the things that he would come up with that somehow made sense. He was way too good at lying. As Walt got even more distant to his family, he by default started to seemingly get closer to Jesse Pinkman. And it seemed like Walter White started to view Jesse Pinkman as sort of a son-like figure. And this kind of put him in a weird spot, because he knew that, he cared about Jesse, but there's no way that Jesse would ever be able to be around his family, because he would never tell his family that he was in the drug business. So it put him in a weird spot where Walter White would find himself battling his own emotions. And it was as if, in my opinion, it was like he was walking on a ledge, not knowing which side the drop-off was at. His feelings would change in the moment when he would have subtle reminders of the original intent behind making the meth, which was to just leave some money to his family. But this original intent slowly got corrupted as he got more prideful when his name was starting to get known. As he started to make more money, he just wanted it more and more and more, and it gave him sort of a high. Every time that he would find himself feeling close to Jesse Pinkman, he would realize that the business means more. So he ended up using this bond with Jesse to manipulate Jesse. Jesse Pinkman basically became like a pawn to Walter White. But with Jesse being so young and, with not really as much intellect as Walt when it comes to certain things, he ended up falling into the traps where Walt would use him. And Jesse ended up becoming the punching bag whenever dealings didn't go right. Usually Jesse was the one to suffer and Walt would go untouched. While Walter sort of got a high on his name being known and his notoriety that he was building up, Jesse Pinkman started, from the beginning of the show, he had battled drug addiction using crystal meth, and his sobriety, there were times when he wanted to be sober, there were times when he didn't want to be. So although Walt was not technically using drugs, in my opinion, he was just as guilty as Jesse Pinkman. It's just they were two separate kinds of highs. As things progress in the story, Walter and Jesse start doing dealings with a man by the name of Gustavo Fring. And after attempts to isolate Walt and get rid of Jesse, and then realizing that Walt couldn't be controlled, almost killing Walt, things happen and they end up being able to take out Gustavo Fring. And Gustavo had a double life, a successful double life, where he ran a chicken restaurant. He was close to the DEA and local leaders. And anyway, with Gustavo being defeated, it gave Walter and Jesse both the opportunities to safely get away from the drug business. They got a big payout and they were able to potentially just step away completely, which would have gave Walt the perfect time, to just be done with it, get back to his family and have that money for them. But just like a drug addict, Walt had no choice, or in his head he didn't have a choice, but to go back to doing even more dealings with meth. And he used Gus Fring's empire as motivation, and he said that he's now in the empire business, that he wants to build an empire like Gus Fring. But the thing is, there were so many levels to Gus's operations. There's no way Walter had that. Him and Jesse were almost having to do all the distributing themselves. They had like maybe 2 layers of business compared to probably 4 or 5 for Gus. So Walter's pride and ego started to get in his own way, and this starts to be his demise. Gus Fring was also a man who had ties to the cartel, and there's a big difference in being the smartest man in the world of chemistry and teaching and a man who is the smartest in the drug empire business. It's 2 big differences. So it was clear that Walt was going down a path that he would not be able to go down safely. And this is all capped off when his own brother-in-law, Hank Schrader, the DEA agent, finds evidence that Walt is actually Heisenberg, who he had become obsessed with finding the identity of. Walt's bond with Hank was very interesting to me because in the beginning it was clear that Hank and his wife meant a lot to Walt and his family. And I do feel like Walt truly loved Hank, but his loyalty to his immediate family was more important. And he sort of started to look at Hank as an obstacle, that these two were just bound to cross paths. Hank was obsessed with finding Heisenberg. Heisenberg was obsessed with making more money. He ends up looking at Hank as an obstacle. And I also feel like because Walt started getting so distant from his family, to me it seemed like Walt got jealous of Hank because in Walt's absence, Hank became very close with Walt's son, Walter Jr. So I feel like Walt loved him, but he looked at him as an obstacle, and he looked at him with a jealousy because he wanted to have that kind of bond with his son that Hank had. So with Hank, Walt's brother-in-law, figuring out that Walt was Heisenberg, it was clear that the drug business was going to fall apart. And while making meth, when it came to that, Walt was the smartest and could make the purest meth. He was not smart into thinking that his family could go unscathed while he did business with such bad people. And I think that Walter White should have looked at the things that ended up happening to Jesse Pinkman and the people that Jesse was close to along the way. He could have seen the tragedies that happened to Jesse Pinkman's loved ones and took it as a warning that if I don't change things, that's going to be the people that are close to me. They're going to die. They're going to get hurt. And that's the thing. I'm going to shift to Jesse Pinkman. His story ended up being so tragic. It was hard to see how Jesse turned from being such a lighthearted guy who liked to have a lot of fun to having such a hard heart. And he lost so many people. Jesse Pinkman lost his girlfriend Jane. He lost his friend Combo, who was doing deals for Walt and Jesse. He lost his mentor Mike Ehrmantraut that Walt shot. He lost his other girlfriend Andrea. And in the end, Jesse ended up basically becoming a slave for these neo-Nazis who had their own drug operation. So it was sad to see Jesse's personality start to fade away. And it was because his heart was hardened. He ended up getting put into situations that he never thought he would be in, such as having to kill, like with the murder of Gail Bedecker, which was Walt's former partner. It had to be done to save Walt's life and potentially Jesse's. He was not a murderer, but he got forced into killing because it was either live or die in those situations. And anyway, he becomes a traumatized individual. And a lot of the situations that Jesse Pinkman was put into was because Walter White was using him as a pawn, whether Jesse knew it or not. One of the most heart-wrenching things that was hard to see for me personally was seeing how Jesse and Jane ended up building their bond. He basically moves into this new apartment, and the girl next door, her name is Jane. She's also the property manager. They become close. He basically hooks up with her, figures out that she was a former addict, but had been sober for a very long time. And all the while, Jesse is still using crystal meth. But he gets her to do meth with him. He didn't pressure her, but seeing him do it kind of led her back into it. So they end up feeling guilty, though, and they agree that they're going to go to rehab together. All the while, Walter White hears about this, that Jesse's going to go, and he's mad. He's like, "What, you're going to go? We have a business here." And he basically doesn't want Jesse to go to rehab because he wants him there working so that they can make money, or for Walter to make money. There's this one night they're together, and they say that the next day they are going to rehab together. But they get the craving to have one last high. During the night, they had got high, and Jane ends up having an overdose and passing away. One last high. Why is that the case? I feel like for a lot of people addicted to drugs, they're always chasing one more high. And they had hope right on the horizon the very next day, but that one decision changed their lives forever. What, stood out to me with this too, which made me sick to my stomach, was Walter White showed up during the night because he needed to talk to Jesse about something very important. He showed up and got into the apartment as Jane is overdosing. Jesse's asleep. Jane is sitting there convulsing. She got foam coming out of her mouth. Walter just sits there watching her. I'm thinking, Walt, help her, Walt. Just help her. And he chose to sit there and let her die, even though he could have helped her. And at that moment, that's when I realized that Walter White is not Walter White anymore. He's a monster. And that made me sick to see. And it was so sad. That's one of the most memorable episodes to me. You know, in reality, Walter knew that if Jane died, that would push Jesse into doing the business even more and even longer. Walt used Jane's death as a tool to get Jesse Pinkman to make meth with him. And yeah, I realized how selfish Walt was. And, you know, he was willing to use other people's deaths as a tool for his own success. And another situation that to me just capped it off, like I was like, there's no turning back for Walter, is he figures out that his wife is having an affair with her boss. And so, you know, originally the business, he was doing it for his family. But once that happened, him and his wife split up. He couldn't see his family near as much. And he realized that he didn't have anything else except for the business. It was tragic to see, but he chose to become even more of a monster. He could have withdrawn from the business, but in a way, that was his drug. That was what kept him high and kept him hopeful, was the notoriety of being Heisenberg. And the story of Walter White, you know, like I said at the beginning, at first you find yourself rooting for him. Even though he's dealing meth, it's like, yeah, like you're actually living on the edge. You're making the most of your life. You're trying to capture something for your family after you die, but that becomes corrupted. He no longer has that same motive. He becomes a monster. And his partner, Jesse Pinkman, all the while is battling with drug addiction. Walt chooses to bully Jesse, saying, "Oh, you're just a drug addict. You're just this, you're that, you're stupid." When all the while, Walter White has an addiction that is just as harmful. And that's his addiction to this high of being Heisenberg. And yeah, it's to the point to where, you know, the original thing that got him there was this newfound confidence when he figured out he got cancer. He was willing to do things he normally wouldn't do because the consequences wouldn't last that long. And it came to the point to where he figures out he's going through remission and he's angry about it because he's thinking this is, you know, back to my old boring life. That's how addicted Walter White was to being Heisenberg. He was mad that he went into remission for cancer because that meant he no longer had an excuse to run a multi-million-dollar empire of dealing meth, which never was supposed to be what he was doing anyway. Walter White in an alternate universe, he was a billionaire leading the company called Gray Matter. And at the end of the day, that is what pushed him, was the fact that he lost that opportunity. And he ends up losing everyone he's close to. But there's a lot of details that I left out of this. There's 6 seasons, I think. So I know there's spoilers that I said, but there's still a ton that y'all can watch. If you have not watched Breaking Bad, I highly recommend it. It's probably one of my top 10 favorite shows now. And yeah. So if I spoiled anything for you, this is going to be me wiping your memory. Hey, you should watch Breaking Bad. If you enjoyed this video of me going in depth about my thoughts of the show Breaking Bad, then feel free to like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. And I just want to say my channel, it's a lot of it is my podcast that I have. There's a lot of gaming content. And, you know, I'm just trying to do new things as well, like this video. Just trying to post things, see what sticks, because my channel is growing and just evolving. So, you know, you don't got to take out a mortgage to subscribe. It's not that big of a commitment. So feel free to just click that subscribe button. That'll help me out a ton. And yeah, I'd love to hear some suggestions for some video ideas y'all would like to see from me. My name is J Raj, and have a great day.